What is up, guys? The Modern Bodybuilder here. Today we're going to be talking about the complete history of the Mr. Olympia, specifically every Mr. Olympia winner since it began in 1965 all the way up to the present day. For those of you who don't know, or for those of you who don't follow bodybuilding as much, the Mr. Olympia is the biggest show in bodybuilding and the highest title one can win, specifically in the IFBB, or the International Federation of Bodybuilding. The first Mr. Olympia would take place in September 18th, 1965. So the original idea of the Mr. Olympia was to create a competition where all the winners of the Mr. Universe could compete and earn some money. Before the Mr. Olympia, the Mr. Universe was the highest title you could win in bodybuilding, specifically the NABA Mr. Universe, which was a rival organization to the IFBB. The IFBB would create the Mr. Olympia essentially in an attempt to become the dominant force in the world of bodybuilding, which of course, as history would tell us, they would succeed in. So that is why in the 1960s and 70s, you would notice that there were only very few competitors in the Mr. Olympia, and there were years that there was only a single competitor, which we will discuss later on because in this video, we are going to be talking about every single year of the Mr. Olympia and its winners and the competitors. Starting in 1965 with its first ever winner, Larry Scott, who was nicknamed the Golden Boy. Now, Larry Scott would win his first of two Olympias in 1965 against Harold Poole and Earl Maynard, in which he would win $1,000. Harold Poole specifically was the first African American to win the title of IFBB Mr. America. Now, Earl Maynard was also a wrestler for the NWA. In 1966, Larry Scott would again win against these same guys, but now he would also defeat Sergio Oliva, who made his Olympia debut. It was at this time that Larry Scott would announce his retirement from professional bodybuilding. 1967 would see the beginning of the 3-year reign of the myth Sergio Oliva, known for its incredibly full and uniformly long muscle bellies. Now, the fascinating thing during his reign would be that in 1968, Sergio would win uncontested as he was the only competitor that year. Supposedly, there were 3 other competitors, but they all withdrew. The following year, in 1969, we would witness the Olympia debut of arguably the most famous bodybuilder in history, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who placed second at that year's Mr. Olympia, making Sergio the only bodybuilder ever to defeat Arnold on the Olympia stage. 1970 would begin the reign of none other than the Austrian Oak, Arnold Schwarzenegger. He would win every Mr. Olympia competition from 1970 to 1975. So in 1970, Arnold would beat Sergio, but in 1971, Arnold would be the only competitor in the Mr. Olympia. Why is this interesting? Because in 1971 would be the year that the IFBB would issue their non-sanctioned policy, which meant that if you competed in any rival organization, you would not be allowed to compete in the Mr. Olympia that year. Arnold would also win the 1972 and 73 Olympia, and in 74 would be the first Mr. Olympia with 2 weight classes, the over 200 and the under 200. Arnold would win the over 200 and the overall, and of course the following year, Arnold would win again, and that was the year that they filmed the movie Pumping Iron, which mainly focused around the rivalry of Arnold and Lou Ferrigno, who would later go on to star in the Incredible Hulk movies. After this win, Arnold would announce his retirement and pursue a career in acting. But all of us know that that wouldn't be the last time we see Arnold on the Olympia stage. The year following Arnold's retirement, 1976, Arnold's best friend, the Sardinian strongman, Franco Columbu, would win his very first Mr. Olympia title, being the first of the under 200 category to win the overall. Then in 1977, we would see the beginning of the 3-year reign of the chemist Frank Zane. One of the most notable things about this year's Olympia is that this would be the first year that the Sandow Trophy was given out as a prize for the winner of the competition, making Frank Zane the first recipient of the Sandow. This was actually an idea of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jim Lorimer, and Joe Weider. So Frank Zane would continue on to win from 1977 all the way up to 1979. 1979, however, would be an interesting year because this year would mark the Olympia debut of Mike Menser. Why is that so notable? Well, the show prior to that Mr. Olympia, Mike Menser would become the first bodybuilder ever to get a perfect score of 300. And in that Olympia, he would win the over 200 category with again a perfect score. But Frank Zane would edge him out in the overall comparisons. So the question in most people's minds is how can a bodybuilder who the judges viewed as perfect lose in the overall? I would love to hear your guys' opinions on the comment section down below. 1979 was also the last year that they would have an over and under 200 category. The following year, 1980, would arguably be one of the most controversial Mr. Olympias in bodybuilding history because it was this year that we would get to see Arnold make his comeback after a long hiatus from the sport. Critics would say that this was the worst version of Arnold on the Olympia stage because he was significantly downsized, especially in his lower body. Yet, he would still win. Another reason for this Olympia win from Arnold being so controversial is that the 3 years prior, Arnold would be the promoter of the Mr. Olympia and he was also coming back from Hollywood at the time, making him the most famous bodybuilder on the face of the earth. And it made perfect marketing sense if they would have Arnold to win the title. After this, some bodybuilders like Mike Menser and Frank Zane were so disappointed at the results that they would boycott the following year's Mr. Olympia. The 1981 Mr. Olympia would be an even more controversial one, being labeled as the biggest booing show ever in bodybuilding, because this year would be the year that Franco Columbu would make his comeback after breaking his leg during the World's Strongest Man competition. Franco would be significantly off, especially in his lower body, and would have a very visible case of gyno, which is the development of breast tissue in the chest caused by steroid use. Franco, of course, would win that year's Mr. Olympia against a very impressive Tom Platz and Danny Padilla, whom most people say that either of them could have easily taken the title from Franco. 1981 to 1983 was sort of a weird time for the Mr. Olympia. Normally, you would have these bodybuilders have these long reigns of dominance over multiple years. But during these 3 years, you would have three different champions. In 1982, we would see the first African American to win the Mr. Olympia, Chris Dickerson, who personally I believe to be the least impressive Mr. Olympia. The following year, however, would see a very impressive Samir Banut with his signature back and Christmas tree win the Olympia. However, 1984 would mark the beginning of the reign of one of the greatest, if not greatest of all time, Lee Haney, who would set the record for most Olympia wins of all time with 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia wins from 1984 all the way to 1991. What makes Lee Haney so legendary is that he was never defeated during his Olympia reign and would be a dominant force in the history of the Mr. Olympia. Two of the most notable wins would be coming from the 1990 and 91 Mr. Olympia, because the 1990 Mr. Olympia was the year that the IFBB started drug testing all their competitions. This significantly affected the look of the competitors, with most of them looking downsized and less sharp. Lee Haney, however, would still take the win here, with Lee Labrada placing second and Sean Ray who came in third. This little experiment of the IFBB would not last long, however, as it received significant backlash as the competitors didn't look as good. The 1991 Olympia was also a notable year because this would be Lee's last Olympia and would see the Olympia debut of future six-time Mr. Olympia, the Shadow, Dorian Yates, who would place second to Lee Haney. A lot of bodybuilding fans like to speculate that Lee actually retired because of the emergence of Dorian Yates. They say that Lee foresaw the potential of Dorian and thought that he couldn't keep up with the level of size and graininess that Dorian had and will continue to improve upon in the following years. That brings us now to the man who ushered in the era of the mass monster, the Shadow, Dorian Yates. Once people saw how freaky Dorian was, there was no going back, as everyone else was basically chasing after him just to be on a level playing field. From 1992 up to 1997, Dorian would dominate bodybuilding against arguably the most competitive era in bodybuilding, with legends like Nasser El Sambati, Kevin Lebroni, Flex Wheeler, Paul Gillette, Sean Ray. 1997, however, would probably be the most controversial of Dorian's wins. So, that year, he was obviously off. His arms were off as he was coming off of an injury. An absolutely fantastic Nasser would come and place second to him, and people would argue that Nasser deserved to win that competition. And the rest of the lineup, of course, was also incredibly stacked as well. So after Dorian's retirement in 1997, 1998 would begin the reign of none other than the king himself, Ronnie Coleman, who would tie Lee Haney's record of 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles. An interesting fact is that in 1997, Ronnie would actually place ninth. So he went from placing ninth to winning in just a single year. Ronnie would continue to dominate bodybuilding, with his most impressive showing being at the 2003 Mr. Olympia, following a historical event that happened in 2002. In 2002, Ronnie would compete at the GNC Show of Strength and would lose to Gunter Schlierkamp. This is the first time that a current reigning Mr. Olympia would lose outside of the Olympia while they were still reigning. Ronnie would, however, shut everyone up as he would go on to the 2003 Mr. Olympia with his best package ever. Another notable thing about this time was his rivalry with Jay Cutler, who was constantly nipping at his heels. Finally, in 2006, Jay would dethrone Ronnie and win his first of 4 Olympias. Now, unlike Lee Haney, who would remain undefeated until he retired, Ronnie would continue to compete after his reign was over, taking second place in 2006 and fourth place in 2007. And that was the year that he would announce his retirement from competitive bodybuilding. So in 2006 and 7, Jay would win, but interestingly enough, he would lose his title in 2008 to Dexter Jackson. That would make Jay Cutler the only Mr. Olympia to lose his title and come back the following year to reclaim his title. 2009 would arguably be Jay's best look with the iconic quad stomp, winning in 2009 and 10, making him a four-time Mr. Olympia. 2011 would see the first victory of the gift, Phil Heath, defeating Jay Cutler and beginning a 7-year reign. One of the most notable rivalries in his reign would be that with Kai Green, which culminated in the 2014 Olympia which nearly ended in a physical confrontation between Kai and Phil. This would result in 2015 Kai not being able or choosing not to compete. 2017 would be one of the most controversial wins of Phil, which was known as the Year of the Gut. It was this year that a bunch of the competitors in the Olympia showed up with a quote unquote bubble gut, including Phil himself. A lot of people believed that Big Ramy, who placed second, or William Bonac, who placed third, could have easily defeated Phil, as they were the only competitors, well, some of the only competitors, who did not have a distended gut. 2018 would see another historic moment in bodybuilding history. Sean Roden would defeat Phil Heath, who was making his attempt to tie the record of the most Olympia wins. Sean Roden would become the oldest bodybuilder to win the Mr. Olympia at the age of 43. Sadly, Sean would not get the chance to defend his title as he was forbidden from competing in the following year's Olympia due to personal legal issues. He wouldn't be able to compete until his untimely death in 2021. The Olympia title would be vacant for the first time since the retirement of Dorian Yates, making the doors wide open for Brandon Curry to come in and take his spot among the greats. Brandon would be labeled as the king of improvements, as he always would bring an improved package each time he stepped on stage. In 2020, he would face a significant challenger who was none other than Phil Heath, who was making his comeback. Brandon Curry would effectively fend him off and beat him on the Olympia. But there's a catch. Brandon himself would in fact lose the title against a very impressive Big Ramy. So, it was more of a bittersweet moment because he would beat a legend like Phil Heath and prove that he was, in fact, a rightful Mr. Olympia. But he would lose his title to Big Ramy. This Olympia is actually very special to me because this was the first Olympia that I would follow, and this solidified me as a true bodybuilding fan. After Ramy won 2020 and 2021, he would unfortunately drop all the way to 5th place, with the winner of that year being the Persian Wolf, Hadi Choopan, who actually won several times before as the People's Champion. Hadi would present an unparalleled conditioning, even though not being the biggest competitor on stage, especially when next Big Ramy, would prove victorious that year. Not far behind him, though, was former 212 Mr. Olympia champion Derek Lunsford, who would place second. Derek and Hadi, while both being shorter bodybuilders, are really an apples to oranges comparison. Hadi being more freaky, and Derek having that small waist and flaring lats, having that more aesthetic look. The next year, the Olympia would once again change hands, now with Derek Lunsford at the helm. This marked another historic moment in bodybuilding history, with Derek Lunsford becoming the first bodybuilder to win the Mr. Olympia in two divisions. 2022 to 2024 would be a similar case to the early 80s, when each year would have a different winner. 2024 would see a completely different style of physique compared to the shorter Hadi Chupin and Derek Lunsford. Samson Dauda towered over them at the height of around 6 feet and a weight of upwards of 300 pounds on stage. Although undoubtedly a mass monster, Samson still possessed a more classic look with his tapered waist and X frame. The bodybuilding world as of right now seems like it's quite undecided as to what they want a Mr. Olympia to look like, considering that every Mr. Olympia in 2019 is literally an apples to oranges comparison. In the recently concluded Arnold Classic, Samson would lose to Derek Lunsford, opening up the question for a Jay Cutler-like comeback for Derek. We would also have a lot of young bodybuilders nipping at their heels, like Andrew Jacked, Nick Walker, Hunter Labrada, and a bunch of others. I'd love to see your comments down below on who you think will win the 2025 Mr. Olympia. Can Samson defend his title, or will Derek pull off the upset? Or do you think that Hadi Chupin might have something to say about it? Or does somebody else entirely have a shot at winning? Comment down your opinions and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. This has been the Modern Bodybuilder. Thank you for watching.